Imagine a war that not only tears apart decades, but scars history for centuries, a long wave that shakes 3 continents, shakes palaces and fortresses, lights a fire in the hearts of kings, and never goes out. This is the Crusades. But it's not just the roar of weapons and the flames of blood in the desert of Jerusalem, not just a clash of 2 faiths, but the story of 2 worlds, great, majestic, mutually suspicious, meeting in a battle of destiny. Christianity and Islam, 2 great civilizations, 2 faces looking at the same sky, but from different directions. Is all this just about faith? Or is there something deeper, darker, more human? Intrigue, ambition, the lust for power dancing behind silken curtains, decisions made in whispers, not prayers, but negotiations. This war is not just about who holds the key to the Holy Land, but who can rule the world, who can claim history, who can write the future in blood. Amidst the dust and sand, knights emerged, armored, shielded by prayer, but carrying wounds in their hearts and burdens on their backs. They came not just to fight, but to prove their worth, to carve a name, to pursue something they called glory. And above them, the leaders, the popes, the kings, sat in cold stone chambers, making plans, weighing the pros and cons, sacrificing thousands of lives like chess pieces. So, why did thousands of people from all over Europe leave their land, their children, their warm kitchens and village churches to face an enemy they had never seen, in a land they had only heard about from pulpits? What made them believe that the road to heaven passed through the valley of death? This journey was not as simple as black and white, not as holy as the priests say, and not as evil as is whispered in anger. Inside it, there is betrayal, there is loyalty, there are broken promises, there are strategies written not on the battlefield, but in the halls of the Vatican. And when the banner of the cross was raised for the first time, the world changed. This is a story about ambition, about prayer being transformed into war, about a decision that shook the fate of millions of lives, and about the legacy that continues to vibrate in the veins of the world to this day. Don't look only at the big battles, because what is hidden behind it is much deeper, quieter, more thrilling. We'll explore it all, every aisle, every secret room, every breath left between the pages of history that is often ignored. And this story just started. The Crusades were not just a single war that ended in a single generation, but a series of expeditions that stretched from century to century, winding through time and tearing apart the boundaries of the old world. In the Middle Ages, between the 11th and 13th centuries AD, the nations of Western Europe left their cold lands for one burning purpose: to reclaim Jerusalem, the land they held sacred, from the Muslims. And from one symbol, the cross worn around their necks or emblazoned on their shields, a term was born that would echo for centuries: Crusaders. They came not bearing the banner of empire, but the banner of faith. They believed this was God's call, and with that spirit, they marched eastward, leaving behind homeland and family for the promised paradise. But beneath the flames hid a world long fractured. Western Europe, after the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century, was in disarray, disintegrating into small kingdoms, warring with each other, mistrusting each other. Meanwhile, the Islamic world of the Middle East was shining in glory. The Umayyad Caliphate and later the Abbasid Caliphate had united vast lands from Damascus to Baghdad, including Jerusalem, a city holy to Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. But one empire stood between the two worlds, the Byzantine Empire, which had survived the fall of the Western Roman Empire and was now being squeezed by Muslim forces in Anatolia and Palestine. When the Byzantine walls began to crack, they called for help to the cold and turbulent West, and from there the voice came. Pope Urban II. In 1095, at a great council in Clermont, France, he issued a call that had never been heard so powerfully before: "Take your weapons and take Jerusalem for the Lord." He promised absolution to anyone willing to fight in that holy war, and for the deeply religious people of Europe, it was no mere invitation, it was a ticket to heaven. The people responded with enthusiasm. Nobles, knights, even commoners gathered in a wave of fervor that could not be stopped. But this war was not driven solely by faith. Behind it lurked a desire for power. Many European kings and nobles saw an opportunity to expand their territories, fill their coffers, build their reputations, and assert their political dominance, both in Europe and in the East. Traders from Venice, Genoa, and other Italian port cities saw the route to the East not as a path of war, but as a golden one. This war opened the doors of trade that had been locked. The spice routes, silk, and the riches of the East that captivated the imagination of the West. All of this converged in one blazing flame and moved toward Jerusalem. On the other hand, the Muslims hadn't yet fully realized this wave. Their territories at the time were torn apart by internal conflict, frequently plagued by power struggles between dynasties. The Crusades initially seemed distant. They didn't immediately perceive them as a major threat. But as the Crusaders began to penetrate Anatolia and set foot in the Holy Lands, awareness grew and resistance began to be organized. From the ruins of that crisis, a figure was born, who would later become a legend: Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, a leader who was not only skilled with the sword, but also able to unite a divided people. With composure and cunning, he managed to recapture Jerusalem in 1187. But before all that, there was the first wave, the First Crusade. It came after Pope Urban's call at Clermont. Europe, gripped by economic tension and internal conflict, saw the East as a way out. Reports of the suffering of Christians in the Holy Land strengthened the narrative of war. Then, preparations began. Knights mortgaged land, sought sponsors, sharpened swords, and the common people greeted the promise of paradise and forgiveness of sins with hope, with tears, with uncertain footsteps. But not all who set out were trained troops. Thousands of peasants, the poor, the destitute, came to be known as the People's Crusade. They were led by charismatic figures like Peter the Hermit and Walter Sans-Avoir, moving towards Constantinople without strategy, without weapons, with only faith and a fragile dream. In the spring of 1096, the wave began to flow eastward. Constantinople, the capital of Byzantium, greeted them with apprehension, not admiration, for what came was not a trained army, but a sea of hungry people, carrying more burdens than hopes. And finally, their journey turned into tragedy. Along the way, starvation, disease, attacks from the local population, they fell one by one. When they finally reached Anatolia, they encountered Muslim forces, better organized and far better prepared. The first wave was instantly destroyed. The People's Crusade was the first lesson. That morale alone is insufficient on the battlefield, and this was only the beginning. After the failure of the People's Crusade, the winds of history shifted. The next wave was better organized, better prepared, and led by nobles and knights from across Europe. This was the first true campaign which would become the pillar of the Great First Crusade. They came in organized ranks, in trained and sworn armies, led by names that would go down in history: Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond IV of Toulouse, Bohemond of Taranto, and Baldwin of Boulogne. They brought not just men, but also determination, strategy, and a much clearer purpose. This army marched toward Constantinople, bringing hope and strength, but also negotiations. There, they met with Emperor Alexios Komnenos of Byzantium. The emperor demanded that the lands later seized by the Crusaders be returned to the Byzantine Empire. A treaty was reached. It was agreed upon, although, like many treaties in times of war, it would eventually be forgotten and ignored. Then their first major battle met. The city of Nicaea, located in the heart of Anatolia, under the control of the Seljuk Caliphate and led by Kilij Arslan I. In 1097, the Crusaders laid siege to the city. With the support of Byzantine forces, they launched a coordinated and sharp attack. Kilij Arslan, underestimating the enemy's strength after witnessing the failure of the People's Crusade, had not prepared a strong defense, but when he tried to send reinforcements, the Crusaders routed the Seljuks and surrounded the city from all sides, until finally, in June 1097, Nicaea surrendered, not to the Crusaders, but to the Byzantines, who promptly took control of the city. After that victory, the Crusaders did not stop. They continued to move, continuing their march toward Jerusalem. But in July 1097, they were again confronted. The Battle of Dorylaeum broke out and became one of the most dramatic events of the First Crusade. The Seljuks employed their signature tactics: hit and run, attacking suddenly, disappearing, and then attacking again, attempting to break the Crusaders' spirit and morale. But the Crusaders held on, despite the pressure. They maintained their formation and then launched a coordinated counterattack. Finally, the Seljuks were forced to retreat, and this victory opened the way to the heart of the Levant. There, in a desolate and sweltering land, stood a great city, a crucial city that would determine their future journey. Antioch. The siege of Antioch lasted from October 1097 to June 1098. Antioch was more than just a city. It was a strategic gateway to Jerusalem. Capturing it meant controlling the path to victory. But this siege was a terrible ordeal for the Crusaders. They faced starvation, disease, extreme weather, and despair. Supplies dwindled, morale began to crumble, and many lost hope. However, like many great war stories, history is shaped not only by might, but also by betrayal. From within the walls of Antioch came a betrayal. A gate was opened, and the Crusaders entered. In June 1098, Antioch was captured, but they had no time to rest. Shortly after capturing the city, Muslim forces from outside the city arrived to retake it. The exhausted crusader, starving and nearly destroyed, were forced to hold on, and just as hope began to fade, something came that for them was a miracle. Someone claimed to have found the Holy Lance, a weapon believed to be the spear that had pierced Jesus on the cross. This discovery rekindled their spirits, and with renewed faith, they fought again and successfully defended Antioch. Then came the final leg of the journey, the ultimate goal, which had been foretold in prayer and blood from the beginning: Jerusalem. In early 1099, the Crusaders marched on the city, which was then under the rule of the Fatimid Caliphate. They besieged the city for several weeks, facing stiff resistance from the Muslim forces entrenched behind the holy walls. Then, in July 1099, with their strength and confidence gathered, the Crusaders stormed Jerusalem, and the city fell. However, that victory was tainted with blood, for after the city was captured, a massive massacre ensued of both the Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. Thousands of lives were lost in an instant in what would later be called the tragedy of Jerusalem. Jerusalem, the holy city, fell to the cross, and on its ruins, the kingdom of Jerusalem was built as the center of Christian power in the heart of the Middle East. This victory marked the end of the First Crusade, but this war was not the end, but the beginning of something longer and deeper. Although Jerusalem had been captured, a victory that felt like a sign of divine destiny, it was far from over. The territories that had fallen to the Christians were mere islands in a vast ocean of Muslim power, and quietly a storm was brewing on the horizon. The kingdom of Jerusalem, the county of Edessa, the principality of Antioch, and the county of Tripoli, Christian kingdoms that had grown from foreign soil, stood but fragile. They were surrounded by a far greater enemy, more familiar with the land, the weather, and the flow of time. In 1144, the shadow of doom began to creep from the north when Zengi, the powerful leader of the Seljuk dynasty, retook Edessa, Christianity's most distant stronghold and first shield in the east. The news shook Europe. Edessa had fallen, and with it, a panic was born of the bitter realization the victory of the First Crusade was only the beginning, not the end. Pope Eugene III responded with a new call, a call that shook the church steeples and the cloisters, known as the Quantum Predecessores. A call to all Christians to take up the cross once more, to recapture Edessa, to save the remnants of God's kingdom in the Holy Land. This call was not met with silence. Bernard of Clairvaux, a monk whose voice echoed like a prophetic chant, stood in the city square, voicing hope and anger. His words pierced hearts and ignited passions. Thousands listened and followed. And this time it wasn't just nobles or knights. Two of Europe's great monarchs joined the ranks, King Louis VII of France and Emperor Conrad III of the Holy Roman Empire. Their presence brought legitimacy and a heavy burden to a war that was not only holy, but also political. Louis, a king whose heart was set on God, saw his participation as an offering of his life. Conrad, the great imperial leader, was intent on expanding his influence and protecting Christendom from collapse in the East. But the two great leaders did not always operate in harmony. Their coordination was fragile, like a symphony playing out of tune on a war-torn battlefield. They chose the land route through Anatolia, a land of desolation, heat, and danger. There they were greeted by Byzantine Emperor Manuel the Komnenos with diplomatic smiles that concealed concern. Conrad's forces moving first, and soon they were lost in the storm. The Seljuks waited, with shadow-like tactics, disturbing, cutting through, and then disappearing. Without knowledge of the terrain, without adequate logistics, the German army was torn apart, not only by the sword, but by disease, hunger, and exhaustion that slowly trickled to death. They arrived in Jerusalem, not with valor, but with lingering wounds and loss. However, hope was not lost. A new objective was set, Damascus, a city that held the key to Muslim power, and, if captured, would be a monumental turning point. The siege began in 1148. At first, the winds seemed favorable. The Crusaders successfully suppressed the city's defenses. But history has its ironies. Coordination became a phantom again, and Damascus, with its people power and astute defensive strategy, became an immovable rock. Days passed. Divisions among the Crusader leaders grew, like fine cracks slowly splitting the entire edifice. And finally, a bitter decision was made: to retreat. Damascus held, and the world saw that the Crusades were not as powerful as they had imagined. The Second Crusade had ended, not in victory but in disappointment and confusion. In Europe, the echoes of defeat were palpable. Some blamed sin, some blamed the leaders, and still others began to wonder, was this still God's will? Bernard of Clairvaux, who had previously fanned the flames of enthusiasm, now tried to extinguish the embers of disillusionment. He wrote, preached, and prayed, declaring that failure was a test from heaven, and that true victory was yet to come. But far in the east, the Muslim victory at Damascus gave rise to new hopes. The Islamic world began to find its leaders, one by one: Nur ad-Din, and later, Salahuddin al-Ayyubi. The skies in the east slowly changed color, and a new wave of history began to move, slowly but surely. After the failure of the Second Crusade, the wind is starting to turn around, slowly but surely. Muslim power in the Middle East begins to rise again, led by a man who will later be remembered not only by the Islamic world, but also by his enemies. As a figure full of honor and compassion, he is Salahuddin al-Ayyubi. Born in 1137 in Tikrit, Iraq, amidst the Tigris winds that bear witness to his childhood, he grew up under the auspices of the Zengid dynasty during the reign of Nur ad-Din, the unifier of Syria. Since he was young, Salahuddin showed brilliance in tactics. But that's not what makes it stand out. He is wise, patient, and a leader who not only conquered cities, but also the human heart. One by one, Muslim factions once divided by ambition and differences united under his banner. The Fatimids in Egypt, the Arab tribes, the forces from Syria to Iraq, all became part of a vast movement to reclaim the Holy Land. Then, in 1187, came a day that would be remembered for centuries. On the parched plains of Hattin, under a searing sky and a wind that carried the scent of burning pastures, the Christian army, led by King Guy of Lusignan, made a fatal mistake. They marched into waterless terrain, and Saladin, with the patience of a desert eagle, cut off their supply lines. The Christian army was thirsty, trapped, and here history records its ultimate defeat, a defeat that shook Europe. The Holy Cross, the most revered relic of Christianity, fell into Saladin's hands. A few months later, Jerusalem, the heart of all dreams and ambitions, fell into his hands too. But unlike in 1099, when the Crusaders had swept the city in blood, Saladin chose the path of mercy. There was no massacre, just a deal, a ransom, and a chance for the vanquished to depart safely. In that act, he demonstrated that glory does not always come from the sword, but from forgiveness. This news pierced the walls of the European churches like a fiery arrow. The cry of the loss of Jerusalem echoed across the continent, and Pope Gregory called for another holy war. The Third Crusade began, and this time, great names took to the battlefield. Richard I of England, the Lionheart, Frederick I Barbarossa of Germany, and Philip II of France. 3 kings, one goal, to recapture the Holy City. Frederick, the mighty old emperor, set out early, penetrating Anatolia with thousands of troops. But fate had other plans. In the river Salif, his body sank in the cold water, and the morale of his troops sank with it. Richard and Philip chose the sea route, coming in magnificent ships through the waves to the shores of Acre. There, the siege began. Acre, Saladin's heavily fortified port city, became a test of patience and strength. 2 years of blood and sand, until the city finally fell to the Crusaders, giving them a foothold in the Levant. But that strength was fragile. Philippe returned to France, leaving Richard to continue the struggle alone. The Lionheart, with legendary courage, moved toward Jaffa, but on the way came the Battle of Arsuf. Saladin's forces stormed in like a storm, but Richard stood firm and fought back with full force. The victory raised anew hopes that Jerusalem might be recaptured, but when they arrived, the city walls were fortified, logistics were thin, and the troops were exhausted. War turned to negotiation. In September 1192, 2 great leaders sat down in the shadow of history and drew up a peace treaty. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands, but Christian pilgrims were allowed to come safely. Coastal cities like Jaffa and Acre remained in Crusader hands. The Third Crusade did not bring complete victory, but it left something even rarer in the long history of this conflict: a peaceful pause and mutual respect between 2 great leaders. Saladin remains remembered as a hero who defended not only his land, but also the dignity of his people. Richard, the Lion of the West, became a symbol of courage and unwavering determination. Yet the world knew peace was fragile, and the shadow of war had not yet completely vanished. After the Third Crusade ended, and Jerusalem remained elusive, Europe once again stirred with a yearning that lingered. The echo of bells from the monasteries far to the west sounded like a call from an unreachable holy land, but the warlike fervor this time did not come entirely from the burning bosom of faith, but from the trading halls and the cold calculations of merchants. The Fourth Crusade was born not only from altars, but also from the docks and negotiating tables. The Italian cities, especially Venice, saw opportunity in blood and pilgrimage, and with the keen eye of commerce, they charted a new course for the banner of the cross. In 1198, Pope Innocent III called for a new campaign, hoping to erase the failures of the past and reclaim Jerusalem, the city that remained silent, gazing out over Europe in the bronze glow of dusk. But from the start, the shadows of a rift were already visible in the ranks. Logistics, leadership, and the goal itself wavered, shifted, like the sand beneath a caravan's feet. As the Crusaders searched for ships to cross the sea to the Middle East, Venice stood as their only hope. Doge Enrico Dandolo, old, blind, yet as cunning as an invisible wave, saw an opportunity to expand his power and gold. They agreed. Venice would build a magnificent fleet provided the Crusaders paid a high price. But the warriors, who came with faith, did not come with enough coin. Dandolo made an offer, a grim compromise. Help Venice capture Zara, a Christian city that dared to defy. And the Crusaders, despite their hesitation, despite knowing that the blood they would shed would be their own, agreed. In 1202, Zara fell under the banner of the cross, and the heavens roared as they watched a Christian city burn in the name of a supposedly holy war. Pope Innocent III, enraged, condemned the act and threatened excommunication. But like a ship that has dropped anchor, the course could no longer be turned. And before the skies had time to clear, a more tempting offer arrived. Prince Alexius IV of Angelus, son of the deposed Byzantine emperor, came bearing promises. He whispered to the Crusaders, "Help me regain the throne of Constantinople, and I will give you gold, ships, and support to take Jerusalem." And that promise was more than enough. In 1203, waves of Crusaders and Venetian ships moved into the heart of the Byzantine Empire, toward Constantinople, not Jerusalem. In July, the fleet arrived before the imposing walls that towered between the water and the blue sky of the Sea of Marmara. The siege began, and though the Byzantine army held out valiantly, they were powerless against two united worlds, the sword of the West and the sail of Venice. Alexius IV rose to power, but his throne seemed to sit on coals. Byzantine finances were in ruins, the people were restless, and anger boiled in the city streets. In 1204, the flames of rebellion burned Constantinople from within, and Alexius IV, who had been a fragile bridge between the two worlds, was overthrown and killed. And the Crusaders, feeling betrayed, who had come no longer for the Holy Cross, but for the promised gold, decided no more diplomacy. They stormed Constantinople. The city that had stood as the crown of Eastern Christianity for 1,000 years fell in flames and screams. The looting began, and no shrine was sacred enough to be left intact. Holy relics were stolen, icons and statues shattered on marble floors, gold melted in the furnaces of the plunderers. The great Hagia Sophia, once filled with liturgical chanting, echoed with laughter, curses, and the thump of horseshoes. Huge swathes of Constantinople burned, and the smoke rose to the sky, rising like prayers forced from a wounded throat. Venice took a large share of the spoils. Europe gained a false sense of pride, and the Eastern Church was left with wounds that never truly healed. The sack of 1204 not only destroyed the city, but destroyed the bridge of faith between Rome and Constantinople, between West and East, between the same cross, but now different paths. And with that destruction, the Byzantine Empire was never again the same power in the Mediterranean or in a changing world. The Byzantine Empire, once as solid as a rock between two continents, after being battered by the storms of the Fourth Crusade, was shattered into pieces and shattered into tiny fragments, struggling to survive the collapse that had begun. Born from those ruins, the empires of Nicaea, Trebizond, and the despotate of Epirus arose like embers left after a fire had died out. They were not successors to glory, but remnants of the flame, trying to preserve the legacy of a slowly sinking world. Meanwhile, in the heart of a shattered Constantinople, the conquerors established the Latin Empire, a fragile structure atop ashes that had not yet cooled. But the empire's life was short, like a false dawn before nightfall, and in 1261, Byzantium, with its dying breath, reclaimed the city that had once been its. But Constantinople was never the same again. The wounds were deep, its soul was torn, and the body of the empire was not strong enough to withstand the great wave rising from the east. The Ottoman Empire, slowly, like a creeping twilight shadow, became a real threat. And in 1453, spring brought not hope, but the end. Constantinople fell, to siege, cannons, and an inevitable fate. But the wounds left by the Fourth Crusade were not merely military, but spiritual. The Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church now stood back to back. The faith that once united was eroded by humiliation and blood. For many Orthodox Christians in the East, the Crusades were not holy struggles, but betrayals, destructions carried out by the hands of their own brethren. And those wounds have continued to throb for centuries, even to this day. The Fourth Crusade served as a sign that even noble aims can be diverted by the lust for power. Instead of Jerusalem, the holy banners turned toward gold, toward ports, and political calculations. Venice was not just an ally, but a shadowy director. This war was proof that trade and faith could collide or ally in chaos. The attack on Constantinople, a Christian city, revealed a harsh reality. The Crusades had become a tool for European nations to pursue their own worldly interests, and behind it all, a growing awareness began to emerge in Europe that defending the Crusader kingdoms in the East was more difficult than imagined. Although popes and clergy continued to call for their own version of jihad, the spirit among the nobility began to wane. The question arose: was this path still sacred? Or was it just a dark alley full of deceit? Even so, Europe wasn't done yet. Pope Innocent III, deeply disappointed with the course of the Fourth Crusade, did not give up. With a heavy but hopeful voice, he called for another, a fifth crusade. He wanted to make amends, return the focus to the Holy Land, and hope that this time Jerusalem would be restored to the Christian fold. The Fifth Crusade began in 1217. This time it didn't head directly to Jerusalem, but through Egypt, the center of power of the increasingly powerful Ayyubid dynasty. If Egypt could be captured, then the way to Jerusalem would be open. Such was the hope whispered from one altar to another. King Andrew II of Hungary, Leopold VI of Austria, and John of Brienne raised their swords and invaded Egypt. Their primary target, Damietta, a vital port in the Nile Delta. A long siege began, and finally, in 1219, Damietta fell. But this victory was like a flower growing in frozen ground. There was no further strategy, and heavy rains, floods, and divisions among the leaders hampered everything. Finally, in 1221, a peace treaty was signed, and the Crusaders left Egypt, silent and disappointed. But history was not over, and the call to retake Jerusalem continued to echo across Europe. The Sixth Crusade followed, this time in a very different way. It was not the sword that was the primary weapon, but diplomacy. Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, who had been excommunicated by Pope Gregory IX for procrastinating on the crusade, finally set out in 1228 But instead of taking up arms, he opened talks, and with Sultan al-Kamil of Egypt, who was then facing pressure from many directions, Frederick forged a treaty without a single drop of blood. Jerusalem, Nazareth, and Bethlehem were handed over to Christian rule through the Treaty of Jaffa in 1229. Jerusalem returned, but Frederick remained a heretic. The excommunication remained, and his victory was not celebrated as a victory. Moreover, the Holy City did not last long. In 1244, Jerusalem fell back to the Muslims, and once again, the banner of the cross was torn. But there were still those who would not give up. The Seventh Crusade was led by King Louis IX of France, one of the most pious rulers, who considered crusading a true spiritual calling. In 1248, he began a holy campaign, aiming to capture Jerusalem via the same route, Egypt. Damietta fell again in 1249. However, as before, logistical difficulties, floods, and strategic errors plagued the Crusader ranks, and in 1250, at the Battle of Mansoura, King Louis himself was captured. The standard of the crusade fell, and only a large ransom returned it to France. Centuries after the first cry was uttered from the Pope's pulpit, the fire of the desire to capture Jerusalem has not yet died out. But after one failure after another, the story slowly lost its luster, shifting from a spiritual mission to a struggle for influence, from piety to ambition. Although the Eighth Crusade ended in failure in a distant foreign land, King Louis IX remained a hero in his own country. He was revered not for his victories on the battlefield, but for the unwavering faith and sacrifice he made as a faithful king. Louis IX would later be canonized as a saint, not by the sword, but by devotion. But the campaign he led, the Eighth Crusade, was the final bell of a long, grueling effort, this time not to Jerusalem or Egypt, but to Tunis, a choice rooted more in politics and commerce than in the Holy Land. The plan ended in tragedy. King Louis fell ill, his body unable to withstand the heat of North Africa, and died in a land that was never the lofty goal he had once dreamed of. The year 1270 marked the end not only of Louis IX's life, but also of the great crusades led directly by the European crowns. The armies returned home, heavy-hearted and empty-handed. Afterward, only fragments remained. Smaller expeditions continued, but none matched the scale and fervor of their predecessors. The Fifth through Eighth Crusades left deep scars, not just wounds in the East, but also major cracks in Europe's very fabric. In Europe, the power of kings shifted, some strengthened through warlike fervor and tax collection, but many others collapsed, broken by the economic burden and frustration of a people weary of endless war. Treasures were squandered. But Jerusalem remained elusive. Meanwhile, the gap between the Catholic Church in the West and the Orthodox Church in the East widened, unhealed since the dark events of the sack of Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade. For many Eastern Christians, the wound never healed, and the brotherhood between the churches remained only a bitter memory. On the other side of the world, Muslims are slowly uniting. Dynasty after dynasty rose, and the Mamluks of Egypt became a formidable new power. It was they who finally drove the remnants of the Crusader army from the coast of the Levant. Fortress after fortress fell, Antioch, Tripoli, until finally the last city that stood proudly, Acre, could no longer hold out. In 1291, the walls of Acre fell, not just physically, but symbolically. It is the last bastion, the last hope, a silent witness to centuries of struggle. After a long siege, the Mamluk army under Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil conquered the city, and with the fall of Acre, the end of any significant Christian power in the Holy Land, there were no more major calls from the west to take Jerusalem after that. There are no longer thousands of people who leave their homes and families for the sake of the cross flag. The era of the Great Crusades ended slowly, not with a triumphant bang, but with a long silence and emptiness. And slowly, as the dust of war settled on the deserted fields and the ruins of ancient cities began to be swallowed by silence, the relationship between Europe and the Islamic world shifted. From the clanging of swords to the trembling of words, from the clash of armies to the murmur of diplomacy. The once thunderous open conflict was replaced by negotiations, trade, and sometimes, just sometimes, small confrontations that no longer shook the heavens. The Crusades, though they failed to reach Jerusalem, left a deep imprint on the minds and souls of Europe. Socially, they solidified the position of the Catholic Church, the Pope as the supreme voice, the leader who called for holy war from his spiritual throne in Rome. These wars became testing grounds where adventurers, nobles, and commoners alike tried their luck in the East, seeking glory, land, or new hope. Some returned, wounded and empty. Some never returned at all. But from the cracks of tragedy, new paths emerged, not only for soldiers, but for merchants. The European economy slowly grew, thanks to the open trade between two once hostile worlds. Italian port cities like Venice, Pisa, and Genoa thrived on the trade of spices, silk, gems, and fine art coming from the Middle East. Goods that had once been mere dreams now flooded Western markets, and more than that, knowledge flowed, science from the Islamic world, clear mathematics, astronomy that gazed at the stars, medicine that touched the body and soul, philosophy that shook reason, all of this slowly settling in the hearts of Europe, and one day would become the seeds of a rebirth, an age called the Renaissance. For Muslims, the Crusades were a wave of threat, a shadow that kept coming from the west, disturbing the lands they had guarded. Yet, it was from this pressure that unity began to emerge. Muslims, previously divided, found a common enemy and rose together. One figure who blazed a trail of resistance was Saladin al-Ayyubi. He was not just a general, but a unifier, who, with his gentleness and firmness, managed to raise the banner of Islam and recapture Jerusalem in 1187. The Ayyubid dynasty he led, and then the Mamluk Sultanate after him, built fortifications and strengthened their military forces, not out of a thirst for power, but because they knew the threat from the west was not over. Egypt, under the Mamluks, became the last bastion of Muslims, protector of the Holy Land, guardian of the legacy of the prophets. However, the long war also left scars on the Islamic world. Holy and strategic cities like Jerusalem, Antioch, and Tripoli were destroyed by fire and blood. Economies were disrupted, lands were burned, and generations were born amidst anxiety. The impact of the Crusades did not simply disappear, it permeated, becoming a lasting tension between two civilizations, Christian and Muslim. The hatred sown in battle grew in hearts for centuries, especially after events like the sack of Jerusalem and Constantinople. The wounds deepened and became difficult to heal. However, time like a gentle stream, always finds its way. After the Crusades, cultural and trade interactions between the two worlds gradually strengthened. Muslim scholars and merchants began to enter Europe, bringing the light of knowledge and diversity. War was replaced by exchange. Venice, which had once supported the Crusaders, now became a trade bridge with the Islamic world. These interactions were not always peaceful, but they laid the foundations for deeper and more complex cross-cultural relationships. Even the buildings of Europe changed. The fortresses and castles built during the Crusades employed architectural techniques from the Islamic world. The majestic and towering Gothic style derived from the inspiration the Crusaders found in the lands they had conquered. The legacy of the Crusades is a complex story. It's not just a sacred tale or a tale of blood, but also a story of the meeting of two worlds, about how battle gave birth to exchange and hatred gave way to admiration. Militarily, it's a long chapter in the history of conflict between Europe and the Islamic world, but culturally, economically, and intellectually, it became a bridge. It's an irony that from the blaze of war, a spark of light for civilization was born. Jerusalem may not have been fully recaptured, but the world changed, and that change continues to beat to this day. And this is the figure of a figure involved in the Great War, the Crusades. His name was Odo of Logari, a name that may sound unfamiliar, but one that would later resound throughout Christendom, as Pope Urban II. He was born around 1042 in the small village of Logari, near Châtillon-sur-Marne, growing up in a world torn between hope and fear, between sin and faith. From a young age, Odo treaded the path of knowledge and spirituality. He was not only a thinker, but also a man who understood the pulse of the times. He studied, meditated, and served, until finally, in 1088, he was elected Pope, the leader of the Catholic Church in the midst of a storm. Pope Urban II led the Church during a difficult time. The Christian world was torn apart by the presence of anti-popes, and relations with the Holy Roman Empire were tense. Yet, in the midst of it all, he stood, unafraid, carrying the torch of reform and the spirit of unification. He believed that the Church must be cleansed, strengthened, and reoriented to its sacred calling. He wanted to build a church not just from stone, but from righteous hearts and unwavering faith. But his name would be best known not for the Reformation, but for one speech, a speech that shook Europe and brought a wave of troops from all directions. Clermont, 1095. This is where everything changed. At a great council before bishops, nobles, and people, Pope Urban II stood. With a voice full of fire and conviction, he issued a call to reclaim the Holy Land, which had fallen into Muslim hands. He pleaded, challenged, and moved souls with words that would be remembered. Deus vult, God wills it. That call became the first drumbeat of the First Crusade. It was not just a military battle, but a war of faith that would forever change the face of European history and the Islamic world. The Crusaders began their march toward Jerusalem, a city holy to three religions, and in the summer of 1099, Jerusalem fell to them. But Urbanus did not live to see that moment. He died just a few weeks later, on July 29, 1099, in Rome. He never knew how his speech had set in motion a chain of events that would reverberate for centuries. Wars, diplomacy, cultural exchange, and tensions between two great worlds all began with the voice of one man who believed that God was calling his people to action. Pope Urban II was a man who not only led, but also shaped the course of history. He paved the way, not only to Jerusalem, but to a new chapter in relations between East and West. He is a whale in the storm, a fire in the darkness, and a voice that, once it resonates, never truly dies. The second is Richard the Lion King, Coeur de Lion. His name resonates in legend not only because of the crown he wore, but because of the courage he carried with every breath. A king who fought more than he ruled, and who was more renowned on the battlefield than at court. He was born on a September morning, September 8, 1157, in Oxford, England, the son of King Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. But from childhood, royal blood was not enough to describe him, for within his heart beat the heart of a warrior. His nickname, Coeur de Lion, Lionheart, was no empty title. It reflected a nearly unmatched courage. Richard was not just a leader, he was a true warrior, one who led from the front, one who fought in the storm, one who feared death. When the Third Crusade summoned the kings of Europe to respond to the fall of Jerusalem to Saladin, Richard answered the call with drawn sword and fiery determination. He left England, a land he almost never returned to, for a single purpose, to reclaim the Holy Land. In the dust and heat of Palestine, Richard fought with a prowess that amazed friend and foe alike. He won battles, captured fortresses, and displayed remarkable intelligence and courage. Yet, despite one military victory after another, Jerusalem remained beyond his grasp. The city remained the enemy's, though blood had been spilled and lives had been lost. There was no crown in the Holy Land for him to wear as proof of his success. But Richard returned with his head held high, for though he failed to capture the holy city, he left his mark as a king who feared no death and a leader beloved by his soldiers. He spent the final years of his life not in London, but in the lands of France, fighting for territory and power. And it was there, in 1199, an arrow, not from an army, not from a kingdom, tore his skin and killed him. He died of that wound at the age of not yet 42. But his legacy transcends time and his mortal body. Richard the Fern is remembered as a symbol of courage and heroism, a figure who defined the spirit of medieval European chivalry. He was not just a historical king, but a legend that inhabited songs, poems, and even the souls of warriors in later ages. He was a king who fought for his beliefs, who carved his name not on a tombstone, but in the long memory of mankind. Richard the Lionheart forever stands in the silence of history, with his sword drawn and his eyes fixed on the Jerusalem he could never possess. The third, Friedrich Barbarossa. Behind the thick fog of the Middle Ages, hidden the majestic figure of an emperor, with a red beard burning like a coal that never goes out. He is called the emperor who combined charisma with strength and transformed into a legend, not just in history but also in myths whispered from generation to generation. Born of Hohenstaufen noble blood, one of the most influential families in German lands, Frederick ascended the throne of the Holy Roman Empire in 1152, bringing with it great ambitions to unite a fractured region under one sparkling crown. As Holy Roman Emperor, he ruled not only with the sword, but with the firmness of a leader who is not afraid to challenge anyone, including the Pope in Rome. His conflict with the papacy was a constant shadow of his reign, a push-pull between earthly and heavenly authority, between crown and cross, between the emperor and the pope. Barbarossa was more than just a ruler. He was a symbol of German power, a king who sought to subdue northern Italy, consolidating his power amidst the turmoil of the times and leaving his mark on cities and fortresses that still stand as silent testaments to his resolve. But history called him further, to the turbulent Holy Land, as the Third Crusade raged and Jerusalem wept under the shadow of Muslim rule. Frederick answered the call with a vast army and a seething resolve, setting out from German soil for the heart of the Islamic world. But it wasn't the sword or the enemy that claimed his life. En route, while crossing the Salef River in Anatolia, now known as the Göksu River in Turkey, that year, 1190, the emperor drowned. It was as if the waters swallowed not only his body, but also the great hope of victory from the north. His forces were divided, their morale was shattered, and the dream of conquering the Holy Land vanished with the current. But his death was not the end. In the minds of the German people, Barbarossa never truly died. Legend has it, he slept in a cave in the Kyffhäuser Mountains, surrounded by loyal knights, and his red beard continued to grow in a circle around the stones, and one day, in a dark and chaotic future, he would rise to restore the glory and greatness of his homeland. Friedrich for Barbarossa was more than a historical figure. He was a living myth, a pillar of the Germanic spirit, and the image of a king who combined power, idealism, and courage in one. In the gentle echoes of centuries gone by, his name still resounds, red-bearded on horseback, towards a glory that has never fully faded. Fourth, from a Muslim figure, from the warm desert and the winds that carried the dust of history, a figure was born who will be remembered not only as a conqueror, but as an example of honor, courage, and compassion. He was Salah al-Din al-Ayyubi, the Kurdish commander, the Sultan of Egypt, the founder of the Ayyubid dynasty, and the light of the East that shone even in the eyes of his enemies. He was not only a military leader, but a skilled statesman, building not just power, but also civilization and justice. From the lands of Egypt to the heart of Syria, he united the divided Muslims, inspiring a spirit of unity at a time when war raged between the Islamic world and Europe. However, Saladin's name is most remembered in history in 1187, when the dust of battle on the plains of Hattin became a testament to his tactical genius and fortitude. With troops led with honor, he defeated the Crusaders and reclaimed the holy city of Jerusalem, which for almost a century was in European hands. But his greatness did not stop with victory. When Jerusalem fell into his hands, there was no massacre, there is no blind revenge. He opened the city gates to those who wished to leave safely, protect holy places, and treated the captives with even generosity, leaving the enemies speechless in awe. Richard the Lionheart, leader of the Third Crusade and his most formidable enemy, respect him, not because of fear, but because of the greatness of his soul. In a world filled with cruelty and hatred, Salahuddin stands as an exception, a soldier who brings peace, a conqueror who inspired love and respect in the hearts of enemies and friends. He is not only a symbol of the glory of Islam, but a symbol of humanity, a leader who not only scores victories, but also the hope that even in war, there is a place for compassion and honor. Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, your name will live on in the halls of the mosque, in nightly tales, and in the pulse of the civilization that you glorify. And finally, from the expanse of the Anatolian plains, among the mountains and valleys that resounded with the echoes of war, stood a formidable leader from the east, whose name is etched in the early chapters of the Crusades, Sultan Kilij Arslan I, king of the Seljuk dynasty of Rum, gatekeeper of the Islamic world in Asia Minor, and one of the first to oppose the massive wave of crusaders from the west. When the battle cry echoed from the Council of Clermont, and thousands of Christian troops began to march toward the Holy Land, Sultan Kilij Arslan was ready, knowing that this battle was not merely a territorial struggle, but a fated meeting of two worlds, carrying together centuries of faith, ambition, and resentment. He was brave, a sharp mind, and quick on the battlefield. He successfully crushed the Crusader people's army, an initial wave that came without discipline and strategy and made Anatolia the first burial ground for unharmed fanaticism. However, this triumph was short-lived. When the main Crusader army, better organized and numerous, penetrated Asia Minor, Kilij Arslan found himself facing a force not only composed of knights, but also driven by religious resolve and the support of European monarchs. At the Battle of Dorylaeum in 1097, he attempted to stem the tide, utilizing his characteristic swift cavalry attacks and the familiar Anatolian terrain. However, despite his undeniable courage, the enemy's numbers and strategy were too great. He was forced to retreat, and Anatolia slowly slipped from his control as the tide of crusaders continued to surge south. Although ultimately defeated, Sultan Kilij Arslan is remembered as the first symbol of resistance, as the initial wall that tried to stop the tide of crusaders, as the leader who faced the greatest test ever to strike the heart of Seljuk power. In the tumultuous history of the Crusades, his name may not be as prominent as Saladin or Barbarossa, but without his initial resistance, the Crusaders' journey might have been uneven, and the struggle for the Islamic world might have lost its first foothold. Sultan Kilij Arslan I, in the harsh and dusty annals of history, you stand steadfast, brave, and never submit without a fight.